My name is Martha Two Eagles Hughes, and I thought the hardest battle of my life ended when I buried my husband on our Texas ranch 5 years ago. I was wrong. The real war began the night my own son's bride slapped me across the face in front of the entire town and demanded I hand over the keys to my land. She called me a half-breed squaw who had no right to prime Texas real estate. What she didn't know was that this poor old Cherokee widow had been hiding secrets that could destroy her and the corrupt railroad company backing her scheme. In 1883, Cedar Falls, she picked a fight with the wrong woman. Join me as I reveal how Cherokee wisdom and hidden wealth turned the tables on those who tried to steal everything I held dear. This is my story of betrayal, justice, and the ancient strength that flows through Cherokee blood even when the whole world tries to make you forget who you are. Something was wrong with the wind this morning. I felt it the moment I stepped onto the wooden porch. The way the air carried an edge that had nothing to do with the October chill. My Cherokee grandmother used to say, the spirits whispered warnings through the prairie grass. And after 58 years on this Texas soil, I had learned to listen. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. But beneath the beauty lay a restlessness that made my paint mare, Ayanna, stamp her feet nervously in the corral. The Double T Ranch stretched out before me, 2,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Cedar Falls County. Yet today, even my beloved cattle seemed uneasy. Their usual peaceful lowing replaced by an anxious shifting. I pulled my woolen shawl tighter and whispered the morning prayer my mother had taught me. Ski, galv quodiu ale, skiu husti. Thank you for life and for this day. But even as I spoke the sacred words, my heart carried the weight of approaching storm clouds, though the sky remained clear. 23 years I had walked this porch each dawn, first beside my husband Thomas, then alone after his passing 5 years ago. Thomas had built it facing east, understanding that my Cherokee blood required me to greet each sunrise with gratitude. He had been one of the rare white men who saw my heritage as strength rather than shame, something to be honored rather than hidden in a territory where Cherokee ancestry could close doors and silence voices. Mounting Ayanna, I rode toward the eastern pasture where our longhorns grazed alongside the Herefords Thomas had brought in before his death. The familiar rhythm of hooves on packed earth usually calmed my spirit. But today, even the morning ritual felt shadowed by unnamed dread. The cattle lifted their heads as we approached, and I found myself counting them with unusual care, as if something precious might disappear without warning. The sound of the Texas and Pacific Railroad's morning whistle echoed across the prairie, that twice-daily reminder of how quickly our world was changing. The railroad had transformed Cedar Falls from a sleepy cattle town into a bustling hub where newcomers arrived daily, bringing both opportunity and complications. My son Samuel worked for the railroad company now, a steady job that should have filled me with pride. Yet lately, his letters had carried a distance that worried me more than I cared to admit. Returning to the ranch house as the sun climbed higher, I found Maria already preparing breakfast, her weathered hands moving with the efficiency of 15 years' practice. The Mexican woman had been our anchor through Thomas's illness and death, her loyalty unwavering even when some townspeople questioned whether a half-Cherokee widow could manage such a large operation. Buenos dias, Señora Martha? She greeted me, but her usual warm smile seemed strained. A letter came very early. The boy who brought it? He seemed nervous, like he carried bad news. My hands trembled slightly as I recognized Samuel's handwriting, though the careful script looked somehow different, more formal than the casual scrawl I knew so well. Breaking the wax seal, I unfolded the paper and felt my heart sink with each word. Dear Mother. It began not Dearest Mother, as he had always written, but the cold formality of a business correspondence. I write to inform you of my engagement to Miss Victoria Ashford. We will be married this Saturday at the community hall. Victoria's family has planned an elaborate celebration, and the entire town will attend. Your presence is expected, as it would be inappropriate for the groom's mother to be absent from such an important social occasion. The letter continued with details that made my Cherokee blood run cold. Victoria's family has expressed concerns about our family's background and the appropriateness of certain traditions at such a refined gathering. I trust you will understand the need to present ourselves in a manner befitting the social standing Victoria's family maintains. Please dress appropriately for the occasion and refrain from any displays that might be considered unconventional. My hands shook as I read the final lines. Victoria and I have also been discussing our future living arrangements. As a married couple, we will need more space and privacy than my current boarding house room provides. We believe the ranch house, with its ample space and prime location, would be perfect for starting our new life together. We hope you will consider the wisdom of moving to more suitable accommodations for a woman of your age and circumstances. The letter was signed simply, Samuel Hughes, without the "your loving son" that had ended every correspondence since he learned to write. I sank into the kitchen chair, the paper falling from my nerveless fingers. Maria's concerned voice seemed to come from very far away as the full meaning of my son's words settled into my heart like poison. He was not inviting me to his wedding, he was warning me to behave appropriately. He was not asking for my blessing, he was preparing to take my home. "Senora, what is wrong?" Maria asked, her voice tight with worry. I looked up at her kind face, then out the window toward the town where my son was preparing to marry a woman who had convinced him to be ashamed of his own mother. The morning wind picked up, rattling the windows with a sound like distant war drums, and I finally understood what the spirits had been trying to tell me. The storm was not coming, it was already here. The letter lay on the kitchen table like a coiled rattlesnake, its words still burning in my mind as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted down by the realization that my own son had been poisoned against me by a woman who saw my Cherokee blood as something shameful to be hidden away. Standing before the large oak wardrobe Thomas had built for me during our second year of marriage, I stared at my reflection in the mirror mounted on its door. The face looking back showed the wear of 58 years' lines earned from Texas sun and prairie wind, silver threading through hair that had once been as black as a moonless night. But my eyes still held the fire my Cherokee grandmother had passed down through the generations, the same determination that had helped our people survive removal, war, and the endless attempts to make us disappear. My hands trembled as I reached for the dress I had planned to wear to Samuel's wedding, a simple but elegant navy blue wool with modest lace trim, appropriate for a ranch widow attending her son's most important day. But Samuel's letter had made it clear that appropriate meant something entirely different to his bride-to-be. Victoria wanted me to hide who I was, to pretend that half my blood didn't flow from Cherokee veins, to dress and act like a proper white woman who knew her place. I pulled the navy dress from its hook and held it against myself, studying the reflection. It was a good dress, well made and respectable. But as I looked at it now, I saw only capitulation. If I wore this dress, if I followed Samuel's instructions to avoid anything unconventional, I would be betraying not only myself but the memory of every Cherokee ancestor who had fought to preserve our heritage. Setting the navy dress aside, I reached deeper into the wardrobe and withdrew a dress I had not worn in over a year, a rich burgundy silk with intricate beadwork that Thomas had commissioned from a Cherokee seamstress in the Cherokee Nation for our 15th wedding anniversary. The beadwork told the story of the 7 clans, each tiny bead placed with reverence and skill, creating patterns that spoke of ancient wisdom and enduring strength. Wear it with pride. Thomas had told me that anniversary evening, his blue eyes shining with love and respect. Never let anyone make you ashamed of who you are. Martha, your Cherokee blood is not something to hide, it's something that makes you stronger, wiser, more beautiful than any woman I've ever known. I held the dress against my body and felt Thomas's presence as surely as if he were standing beside me. He had been one of the few white men in Texas who truly understood that Cherokee heritage was not a burden to be overcome, but a gift to be treasured. When other ranchers' wives whispered about my savage blood, Thomas had defended me with quiet dignity. When business associates made crude jokes about Indian wives, he had made it clear that such talk would not be tolerated in his presence. Moving to my jewelry box, I opened the carved wooden lid and gazed at the collection of pieces that told the story of my life. There were the simple gold earrings Thomas had given me on our wedding day, the pearl necklace that had belonged to his mother, and the silver bracelet Samuel had made for me in the town blacksmith shop when he was 12 years old, before Victoria Ashford had taught him to be ashamed of his heritage. But my fingers moved past all of these to the pieces that lay in the bottom compartment, the Cherokee jewelry that had been passed down through my mother's line. A silver necklace with turquoise stones arranged in the pattern of the sacred 7 directions. Earrings crafted from silver and coral that had belonged to my grandmother. A bracelet of braided silver that told the story of the Trail of Tears in its intricate patterns. These pieces had been hidden away for too long, kept safe from the judgment of those who could not understand their significance. But Samuel's letter had awakened something fierce in my Cherokee heart, a refusal to be diminished or denied any longer. The sound of horse hooves in the yard drew my attention to the window. Jake Morrison was riding up the lane, his weathered face set in lines of concern. Jake owned the ranch adjacent to ours, and he had been Thomas's closest friend and my most loyal neighbor since my husband's passing. If anyone in Cedar Falls could be trusted with the truth, it was Jake. I quickly changed into a simple day dress and hurried downstairs, meeting Jake on the front porch as he dismounted his sorrel gelding. His gray eyes were troubled, and he removed his hat with the careful respect he had always shown me. "Martha," he said without preamble, "I've been hearing things in town that don't sit right with me. Talk about Samuel's wedding, about his bride's family asking questions about your background." I gestured for him to sit in one of the porch chairs, then settled into the rocker where I had spent countless evenings watching the sun set over the prairie. "What kind of questions, Jake?" He shifted uncomfortably, his weathered hands working the brim of his hat. "Questions about your Cherokee blood, about whether you own this ranch outright, about whether Samuel might be influenced by what they call primitive thinking." His voice carried the disgust of a man who had fought alongside Cherokee warriors during the Indian Wars and knew their courage firsthand. "They've been asking around about your financial situation, too," Jake continued, his voice dropping lower. "Victoria's father was in the bank yesterday, talking to Whitmore about ranch valuations and what happens to property when elderly owners become unable to manage their affairs." The words hit me like a physical blow. They were not content to simply humiliate me at the wedding. They were planning to take everything Thomas and I had built together. The ranch that had been in my husband's family for 2 generations, the land that had become as much a part of me as my own heartbeat, was being eyed like prey by people who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "There's more," Jake said quietly. "I heard Victoria telling some of the ladies at the Mercantile that it's a shame when elderly people become too set in their ways to accept help from family. She said sometimes the kindest thing is to help them make the transition to a more suitable living situation." I closed my eyes and felt the wind pick up across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant sound of cattle. When I opened them again, Jake was watching me with the same protective expression I had seen him wear when facing down rustlers or predators. They don't know who they're dealing with, do they? Martha, he asked. And for the first time since reading Samuel's letter, I felt a smile tug at the corners of my mouth. No, Jake, I replied, my voice carrying the steel that had been forged in Cherokee fire and tempered by Texas wind. They have no idea at all. The community hall beside the Texas and Pacific Railroad depot buzzed with activity as I guided my buggy down Cedar Falls Main Street. The entire town seemed to have turned out for Samuel's wedding, and lanterns strung between the telegraph poles cast dancing shadows across the faces of neighbors I had known for decades. The October evening carried the scent of mesquite smoke and the distant whistle of the evening freight train. But beneath the festive atmosphere, I sensed the undercurrent of curiosity that always accompanied significant social events in a railroad town. I had chosen to arrive precisely at sunset, when the golden light would catch the silver threads in my Cherokee jewelry and announce my presence with unmistakable dignity. The burgundy silk dress rustled as I stepped down from the buggy, and I felt the weight of my grandmother's turquoise necklace against my throat like a shield blessed by ancient spirits. Every piece of Cherokee jewelry I wore told a story of survival, strength, and refusal to be diminished by those who could not understand its power. Martha Two Eagles called out Elena Vasquez, the wife of one of the railroad foremen. She hurried across the dusty street, her children trailing behind her like ducklings. Que hermosa, how beautiful you look tonight. That dress, those jewels, you honor your ancestors. Elena's warm embrace reminded me why I loved this diverse railroad community. Unlike the established ranching families who sometimes viewed newcomers with suspicion, the railroad workers and their families had created a melting pot of cultures where Mexican, German, Irish, and Cherokee traditions mingled with surprising harmony. Elena understood what it meant to preserve heritage in a land that often demanded assimilation. Gracias, mi amiga, I replied, squeezing her hands. Your words give me strength for what lies ahead. As we approached the community hall, I could see the elaborate decorations Victoria's family had arranged, white ribbons and imported flowers that must have cost more than most railroad families earned in a month. Through the open doors, I glimpsed tables laden with delicacies that spoke of Eastern refinement rather than Texas hospitality. This was not the simple community celebration I had expected, but a display of wealth and social positioning that seemed designed to intimidate as much as celebrate. Standing Bear emerged from the shadows near the building's side entrance, his weathered face grave but his eyes warm with approval as he took in my appearance. The Cherokee elder rarely attended town social functions, but his presence tonight told me he understood the significance of this moment as clearly as I did. Daughter of two worlds, he said in Cherokee, using the name he had given me years ago when I first sought his guidance after Thomas's death. You wear your heritage like armor tonight. Good. Some battles require us to show our true faces. Before I could respond, Samuel appeared in the doorway, his face flushing red as he took in my appearance. Gone was the confident railroad man who had written that cold, demanding letter. In his place stood a young man caught between two worlds, the mother who had raised him with pride in his mixed heritage and the bride who demanded he abandon that heritage for social acceptance. Mother, he said, his voice strained. You look striking. Behind him, Victoria Ashford emerged like a vision in white silk and imported lace. Her blonde hair arranged in the latest Eastern fashion, and her blue eyes cold as winter ice. She was undeniably beautiful in the way that money and privilege could create. But there was something brittle about her perfection, as if any crack might shatter the entire facade. Her gaze swept over my Cherokee jewelry with barely concealed horror. and I watched her whisper something urgent in Samuel's ear. His shoulders sagged slightly, and when he looked at me again, I saw the boy I had raised warring with the man Victoria was trying to create. "Mrs. Hughes," Victoria said, her voice carrying the honeyed poison of false courtesy. "How interesting your choice of accessories. I wasn't aware you were so attached to native crafts." The word native dripped from her tongue like something distasteful, and I felt Standing Bear stiffen beside me. But before I could respond, a warm voice interrupted from behind us. "Martha Two Eagles, you are a vision tonight, Reverend Patrick O'Malley, the Irish priest who served our diverse community," approached with his characteristic broad smile. "That necklace belonged to your grandmother. Didn't it? I remember her wearing it to the church dedication ceremony. A woman of great dignity and wisdom, just like her granddaughter." Victoria's smile became even more strained as other community members began gathering around us. Heinrich Müller, the German blacksmith who had taught Samuel metalworking as a boy, clapped my son on the shoulder with genuine affection. "Your mother? She is beautiful tonight, Samuel. You should be proud of such a strong woman." "Indeed," added Dr. James Crawford, one of the few college-educated men in town. "Mrs. Hughes, the Cherokee silverwork is exquisite. The craftsmanship represents centuries of artistic tradition. You honor both your heritage and our community by wearing it." I watched Victoria's face grow paler with each compliment, each expression of respect for the very heritage she had tried to convince Samuel to hide. The railroad town's diversity, which I had always seen as one of its greatest strengths, was clearly something she had not anticipated or prepared for. As we moved toward the hall's entrance, I heard Victoria's voice, pitched just loud enough to be overheard by those nearby. "I suppose we must make allowances for different backgrounds. Not everyone understands what's appropriate for refined society." The words were spoken with a smile, but the venom beneath them was unmistakable. Several of the Mexican railroad families exchanged glances, and I saw Elena's husband, Carlos, frown deeply. Heinrich Müller's jovial expression hardened, and even Reverend O'Malley's eyebrows rose in surprise. Standing Bear moved closer to my side, his presence a reminder that I was not alone in this confrontation. "Some people," he said in perfect English, his voice carrying the authority of his years and wisdom, "mistake cruelty for refinement. They do not understand that true class comes from the heart, not from the purse." Victoria's cheeks flushed red, but before she could respond, Samuel stepped forward with obvious desperation. "Perhaps we should go inside," he suggested, his voice tight with embarrassment. "The ceremony should begin soon." As we moved toward the decorated entrance, I caught sight of Jake Morrison near the far wall, his gray eyes watchful and concerned. Our gazes met across the crowded room, and he gave me a subtle nod of support. Whatever was coming, I would not face it alone. The evening was young, but already the battle lines were being drawn. Victoria had shown her true colors with that first poisonous comment, and the community's response had revealed where their loyalties lay. As I stepped into the hall where my son would pledge his life to a woman who despised half of his heritage, I felt the strength of my Cherokee ancestors flowing through my veins like liquid fire. Let her show her prejudice, I thought. Let her reveal the smallness of her spirit to this community that valued character over bloodline. Before this night was over, everyone in Cedar Falls would know exactly what kind of woman Samuel was choosing over his own mother. The ceremony had been mercifully brief, conducted by Reverend O'Malley with the simple dignity that marked most frontier weddings. But as the evening progressed into the celebration, I could feel Victoria's resentment building like steam in a locomotive boiler. Each compliment directed toward my Cherokee jewelry, each warm greeting from community members, each moment that attention focused on anyone other than herself, added pressure to her barely contained fury. The breaking point came as I stood near the refreshment table, accepting congratulations from the Vasquez family on Samuel's marriage. Their children had gathered around me, fascinated by the stories told in the beadwork of my grandmother's bracelet. When Victoria's voice cut through the conversation like a blade, "How touching," she said, her words dripping with false sweetness as she approached our group. "Mrs. Hughes entertaining the children with her colorful accessories." Elena Vasquez stiffened beside me, recognizing the insult beneath the honeyed tone. Her husband Carlos moved protectively closer to his family, his dark eyes flashing with anger at the implied slight to his children. "These are not mere accessories, Victoria," I replied calmly, my fingers touching the turquoise stones at my throat. "They are heirlooms that carry the history and wisdom of my ancestors. Perhaps if you took time to understand different cultures, you might appreciate their significance." Victoria's perfect smile never wavered, but her blue eyes turned to ice. "Oh, I understand perfectly, Mrs. Hughes. I understand that some people cling to primitive superstitions instead of embracing civilized society. I understand that some people use their background to gain sympathy and special treatment." The conversations around us began to fade as more people noticed the tension building between us. Samuel appeared at Victoria's side, his face pale with obvious distress, but he made no move to defend me or calm his new wife. "Victoria, please," he murmured, but his voice carried no real authority, no conviction that might have diffused the situation. "Please what?" "Samuel." Victoria turned on him with sudden viciousness. "Please continue to pretend that your mother's savage blood doesn't embarrass you. Please ignore the fact that she's living alone on valuable property that rightfully belongs to our future family." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd, even by frontier standards, where plain speaking was valued. Victoria's words crossed lines that should never be breached. Standing Bear, who had been quietly observing from near the wall, stepped forward with the measured dignity that commanded respect from all who knew him. "Young woman," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his years and position as a tribal elder. "You speak of civilization, yet your words show you understand neither respect nor honor. These are the foundations upon which all true civilization is built." Victoria whirled to face him, her carefully arranged composure finally cracking. "Don't you dare lecture me about civilization, you old—" "Victoria." Samuel's sharp interruption came too late. The damage was done. The entire community had heard her begin what could only have been a racial slur directed at one of the most respected men in the county. But Victoria was beyond caring about appearances now. The careful mask of Eastern refinement had slipped away, revealing the ugly prejudice beneath. She turned back to me with fury blazing in her eyes. "This charade has gone on long enough," she declared, her voice rising to carry across the entire hall. "Samuel, your mother is an old woman living alone on property she can't possibly manage. The ranch should belong to us, to our children, to our future. It's time she accepted reality and moved to more appropriate accommodations." The hall fell into complete silence except for the distant sound of the evening train pulling away from the depot. Every eye was fixed on our confrontation, and I could feel the weight of the community's attention like a physical presence. "The Double T Ranch is my home," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. It was my husband's home, and his father's before him. No one has the right to tell me where I should live or what I should do with my property. Rights, Victoria laughed, the sound harsh and brittle in the hushed hall. What rights does a half-breed squaw have to prime Texas real estate you're living on borrowed time? Old woman. Samuel and I have plans for that land, plans that don't include accommodating your primitive lifestyle. The words hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, shocking in their naked cruelty and racism. I heard Elena Vasquez draw in a sharp breath. Saw, Doctor? Crawford's face flush with anger, felt the entire community recoil from Victoria's viciousness. But before I could respond, before anyone could react, Victoria took a step closer to me, her face twisted with hatred. You will give me the keys to that ranch house, she hissed, her voice low but carrying clearly in the deathly silence. You will pack your savage trinkets and move to the old folks' home where you belong. And you will do it with a smile. Because if you don't, I will do no such thing, I interrupted, my Cherokee blood finally rising to meet her challenge. That ranch is mine by law and by right, and no amount of Eastern arrogance will change that fact. The slap came so fast I had no time to prepare for it. Victoria's hand cracked across my face with a sound like a rifle shot, the force of it sending my grandmother's silver earring flying across the wooden floor. The turquoise necklace caught the light as I staggered backward, and for a moment, the only sound in the entire hall was the small metallic ring of the earring settling on the planks. My cheek burned with fire, but the pain in my heart was far worse. In front of the entire community, in front of Standing Bear and the families who had welcomed me, in front of my son who stood frozen in shock. I had been struck like a disobedient servant by a woman young enough to be my daughter. Now, Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence, you will give me those keys, or I will make sure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of unstable, violent woman you really are. She held out her hand expectantly, her blue eyes glittering with triumph. Behind her, Samuel stood motionless, his face a mask of horror and shame. But still he said nothing. Still he made no move to defend the mother who had raised him with love and sacrifice. I touched my burning cheek and felt the wetness of tears I hadn't realized were falling. But as I looked around the hall at the shocked faces of my neighbors and friends, as I saw the pain in Standing Bear's ancient eyes and the fury in Jake Morrison's weathered features, something deep in my Cherokee soul hardened like steel in a forge. You want the keys to my ranch? I asked, my voice carrying a quiet strength that seemed to surprise even myself. Victoria's smile widened in anticipation of her victory. Then you had better be prepared, I continued, my words falling into the silence like stones into still water. To learn exactly who you just struck. The night air felt cool against my burning cheek as I walked away from the community hall, the sounds of the disrupted celebration fading behind me like a bad dream. My hands trembled as I untied Ayanna from the hitching post, but whether from rage or heartbreak, I could not say. The silver earring that had flown from my ear lay somewhere on that wooden floor, a casualty of Victoria's viciousness, but I would not go back to retrieve it. Some things, once lost to cruelty, were better left behind. Standing Bear appeared beside me like a shadow, his weathered face grave in the lamplight. Without words, he helped me into my buggy, then mounted his own horse, a sturdy pinto that had carried him through decades of both war and peace. Together, we rode through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls toward the Cherokee settlement that lay beyond the railroad tracks, where the old ways still held sway and ancient wisdom could be found. The Elders' Lodge sat in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek that sang with the voice of running water, built in the traditional style with logs and clay chinking. It had served as a place of counsel and healing for the Cherokee families who had made their homes in this part of Texas. Tonight, it would serve as a sanctuary where I could seek guidance for the battle that lay ahead. Standing Bear kindled a fire in the central hearth while I sat on one of the woven mats that circled the flames. The smoke rose straight up through the opening in the roof, carrying with it the prayers and troubles of all who had sought wisdom in this sacred space. In the flickering light, I could see the faces of my ancestors in the dancing shadows, reminding me that I was not alone in this struggle. "Daughter of two worlds," Standing Bear said, settling across from me with the careful movements of his 70 years. "The young woman struck more than your face tonight. She struck at the heart of who you are, at the blood that flows in your veins, at the heritage that makes you strong." I touched my swollen cheek, feeling the heat that still radiated from Victoria's handprint. "She wants to take everything, Uncle, the ranch, my home, my dignity. She wants to erase me as if I never existed." Standing Bear nodded slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "This is an old story, granddaughter. The taking of land, the denial of our right to exist, the attempt to make us disappear into the shadows. But we are still here. We have survived worse than one spoiled white woman's greed." He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a bundle of sage, lighting it from the fire and letting the sacred smoke fill the lodge. The familiar scent brought back memories of my childhood, of my grandmother teaching me the old prayers, of ceremonies that connected us to the earth and sky and all the generations that had come before. "Tell me about this woman," Standing Bear said, his voice taking on the tone he used when preparing for battle, whether against human enemies or the darker forces that sometimes threatened the harmony of the community. "Tell me about her family, her plans, her weaknesses." As the sage smoke curled around us, I found myself speaking of things I had only half understood before. Victoria's constant questions about the ranch's value, her family's sudden interest in Texas real estate, Samuel's transformation from loving son to distant stranger. The pattern became clearer as I spoke, revealing a conspiracy that went far deeper than simple greed. "They have been planning this for months," I realized, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. The courtship, the marriage, the questions about my mental state, it was all designed to position them to take the ranch. Standing Bear's expression darkened. "And your son? What role does he play in this deception?" The question cut to the heart of my deepest pain. I don't know if Samuel is a willing participant or simply a fool blinded by a pretty face, but either way, he has chosen her over his own mother, her prejudice over his own heritage. The old man was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking visions in the flames. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of ancient wisdom. "In the old days, when our people faced enemies who sought to destroy us, we did not always meet them with immediate force. Sometimes the wisest course was to watch, to learn, to understand their weaknesses before striking back. The rabbit that runs immediately is often caught by the hawk. The rabbit that waits, that chooses its moment, often escapes to fight another day." I felt my Cherokee blood responding to his words, recognizing the truth in the old strategies that had kept our people alive through centuries of persecution. "You're saying I should wait, let them think they have won. I am saying you should be like the mountain that appears still but moves the earth beneath it." Standing Bear's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement. "You have resources they do not know about, granddaughter. Secrets that could change everything. But secrets are only powerful when revealed at the right moment." He was right, of course. Victoria and Samuel had no idea of the true extent of my wealth, accumulated through years of careful investment in Thomas's shrewd business dealings. they saw only an aging Cherokee woman living alone on valuable land, vulnerable and isolated. They had no concept of the financial power I could wield or the legal resources at my disposal. "What would you have me do?" Uncle I asked, using the respectful title that acknowledged both his age and his wisdom. Standing Bear smiled, and for a moment I saw the warrior he had once been, the man who had fought alongside both Cherokee and white soldiers to protect the frontier communities of Texas. "First, you gather information, learn exactly what they plan, how they intend to accomplish it, who their allies are. Knowledge is the sharpest weapon in any battle." He stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the lodge, returning with an object wrapped in soft deerskin. Unfolding the leather revealed a silver medallion inscribed with Cherokee symbols, a piece that had belonged to my grandmother's grandmother, passed down through generations of strong women who had faced their own battles with courage and wisdom. "Wear this," he said, placing the medallion in my hands. "Let it remind you that you carry the strength of all who came before you. Let it remind you that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from meeting force with force, but from using the enemy's own momentum against them." The silver felt warm in my palms, as if it still held the life force of all the women who had worn it before me. As I fastened it around my neck, I felt something shift inside me, a settling of purpose, a clarification of resolve that had been clouded by hurt and anger. "There is something else," Standing Bear said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Something the spirits have been trying to tell me about the railroad company, about land deals and money changing hands in ways that might not be entirely legal. Your son works for these people. Perhaps it is time to discover exactly what kind of business they conduct." His words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the night air. If the railroad company was involved in Victoria's scheme, if Samuel was somehow complicit in illegal activities, then the web of deception was even more complex than I had imagined. As the fire burned lower and the night grew deeper, Standing Bear and I continued to plan. By the time the first light of dawn began to filter through the cottonwood trees, I had a strategy that would either restore my dignity and secure my future, or destroy what remained of my relationship with my son forever. But as I rode back toward the Double T Ranch in the early morning light, the silver medallion warm against my skin, I knew that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. Victoria Ashford had chosen to make an enemy of the wrong woman, and before this was over, she would learn that Cherokee blood runs deeper than Texas soil and burns hotter than any flame she could kindle. The morning after my night in Standing Bear's lodge, I rose with the sun and a clarity of purpose I had not felt in months. The Cherokee medallion lay warm against my skin, a constant reminder of the strength that flowed through my veins and the wisdom that guided my steps. Today, I would begin to unravel the web of deception that had been spun around my family, using methods both ancient and modern to expose the truth. My first stop was the Cedar Falls Bank, where I had maintained accounts since Thomas and I first established the Double T Ranch. Mr. Whitmore, the bank president, greeted me with the nervous courtesy he had shown since Victoria's father had begun asking questions about my financial situation. His discomfort told me more than any direct inquiry could have revealed. "Mrs. Hughes," he said, adjusting his spectacles with trembling fingers. "How may I assist you this morning?" "I'd like to review my account statements for the past 6 months," I replied calmly, settling into the chair across from his mahogany desk. "All accounts, including the investment portfolio Thomas established before his death." Whitmore's face paled slightly. "Of course, Mrs. Hughes, though I should mention that we've had some inquiries recently about your financial capacity, questions about your ability to manage such substantial assets at your age." The words confirmed what Standing Bear had suspected. Victoria's family was not simply coveting my ranch, they were laying the groundwork for a legal challenge to my mental competency, using my supposed financial vulnerability as evidence of declining faculties. As Whitmore gathered my statements, I studied the man who had handled my family's banking for over a decade. His nervous energy, the way his eyes avoided mine, the slight tremor in his hands all suggested he was hiding something significant. "Mr. Whitmore," I said quietly, "you've known me for many years. Have you ever had reason to question my mental capacity or my ability to handle my affairs?" He looked up from the papers, his face flushed with embarrassment. "No, Mrs. Hughes, never. You've always been one of our most astute clients. Your investment decisions have been remarkably sound, and your understanding of financial matters exceeds that of most men in this county. Then perhaps you could explain why you've been discussing my private affairs with the Ashford family." The direct question hit its mark. Whitmore's hands stilled on the papers, and for a moment, the only sound in the office was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "Mrs. Hughes," he began carefully, "I've been placed in a very difficult position. The Ashford family has connections to the railroad company's financial interests. They've suggested that certain arrangements might be beneficial for all parties involved." "What kind of arrangements?" I pressed, my voice carrying the steel I had learned from Cherokee negotiations and Texas business dealings. Whitmore glanced toward his office door, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "They've proposed a partnership arrangement. If you were to transfer ownership of the Double T Ranch to Samuel and his wife, the railroad company would guarantee you a comfortable residence in San Antonio and a generous monthly allowance for life." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. This was not simply about greed or prejudice, it was about a systematic land grab orchestrated by the railroad company and executed through my own son's marriage. "And if I refuse this generous offer?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They've indicated that legal proceedings might become necessary. Questions about your competency, your ability to live alone, your stability, given your mixed heritage and unconventional lifestyle." The last phrase hit me like a physical blow. They intended to use my Cherokee blood against me, to paint my cultural practices as evidence of mental instability in a legal system that rarely favored Native Americans. Leaving the bank with my financial statements in hand, I rode directly to the railroad depot, where Samuel worked as a freight supervisor. The Texas and Pacific Railroad office bustled with activity. But I noticed how conversations stopped when I entered, how eyes followed my progress across the room. Samuel looked up from his ledger books with obvious surprise and discomfort. "Mother, what are you doing here?" "I came to see where my son works," I replied, studying the office with new eyes, to understand the business that has become so important to him. Colonel Hayes, the railroad company's regional manager, emerged from his private office with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. A Civil War veteran with steel-gray hair and calculating eyes, he had arrived in Cedar Falls 6 months ago coincidentally, around the same time as Victoria's family. "Mrs. Hughes," he said with false warmth. "What an unexpected pleasure. I was just discussing your son's excellent work with our accounting department." "Indeed," I replied, noting how Samuel's face flushed at the mention of accounting. "And what sort of accounting work does a freight supervisor typically handle?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Colonel Hayes's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened with the look of a man who recognized a worthy opponent. "Samuel has been helping us with some special projects. Hayes said carefully. Land acquisitions, property valuations, that sort of thing. Very important work for the company's expansion plans. Expansion plans that include the Double T Ranch? I asked directly. Watching both men's reactions, Samuel's face went white, while Colonel Hayes's expression shifted to one of poorly concealed irritation. Mrs. Hughes, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of our business relationship with your family. On the contrary, Colonel, I replied, my voice carrying the authority I had learned from years of managing a successful ranch operation. I think I understand perfectly. The question is whether my son understands the full implications of the work he's been doing for you. I turned to Samuel, seeing in his face the boy I had raised warring with the man who had been corrupted by promises of easy wealth. Tell me, son, what exactly have you been valuing for the railroad company? What properties have you been helping them acquire? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Samuel's hands trembled as he closed his ledger book, and I could see the moment when he realized that his mother was not the simple ranch widow he had been convinced to betray. Samuel, Colonel Hayes said sharply, I believe you have work to finish. But I was no longer looking at the railroad manager. My attention was fixed on the ledger book Samuel had closed so quickly, and on the papers scattered across his desk that bore the unmistakable heading of property surveys and land assessments. Standing Bear had been right about following the rabbit's trail. The conspiracy was far larger than a simple family dispute over inheritance. The railroad company was systematically targeting valuable properties throughout the county, using marriages, financial pressure, and legal manipulation to acquire land for their expansion at far below market value. And my own son had been their inside man, providing them with detailed information about property values, family situations, and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. As I walked out of the railroad office, I felt the weight of the Cherokee medallion against my chest and heard Standing Bear's words echoing in my mind. Knowledge is the sharpest weapon in any battle. Now I had knowledge. The question was how to use it to protect not only my own ranch but the entire community from a conspiracy that threatened to destroy the lives and livelihoods of everyone I held dear. The war Victoria had started with a slap was about to become something much larger, and I intended to make sure that when the smoke cleared, justice would prevail in the way that only the combination of Cherokee wisdom and frontier determination could deliver. The revelation of the railroad conspiracy had shaken me to my core, but it had also crystallized my purpose with the clarity of winter air. Standing Bear's wisdom echoed in my mind as I rode back to the Double T Ranch. The rabbit that waits and chooses its moment often escapes to fight another day. Now I needed to gather the evidence that would not only save my ranch but expose a corruption that threatened the entire community. That afternoon, I saddled Ayanna and rode to visit Jake Morrison, knowing that his years of experience with land deals and ranch management would prove invaluable. I found him mending fence in his north pasture, his weathered hands working the barbed wire with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent decades building and maintaining his spread. Jake, I called out as I approached. I need your help with something that could affect every rancher in the county. He looked up from his work, taking in my serious expression and the determined set of my shoulders. What's troubling you? Martha. And don't tell me it's just about that fool son of yours and his new wife. I dismounted and helped him stretch the next section of wire, using the familiar rhythm of ranch work to organize my thoughts. It's bigger than that, Jake. Much bigger. The railroad company is systematically targeting valuable properties throughout the county, using marriages and legal manipulation to acquire land at below market value. Jake's hands stilled on the wire. What kind of evidence do you have? I told him everything I had discovered at the bank and the railroad office, watching his face grow darker with each revelation. When I finished, he set down his tools and walked to the fence post, leaning against it with the weight of a man who had seen too many good people destroyed by greed. "Martha," he said quietly, "I think I know of at least 3 other families who've been approached with similar generous offers in the past 6 months. The Hendersons sold their place to the railroad for half what it was worth after their son convinced them they were too old to manage it. The Kowalski family lost their farm when the bank suddenly called in loans that had been stable for years. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was more extensive than I had imagined. We need to document everything. Jake, names, dates, amounts, witnesses. If we're going to stop this, we need evidence that will stand up in court." That evening, Jake and I rode into town together, visiting families who had been affected by what we now recognized as a coordinated campaign of financial manipulation. The stories we heard painted a picture of systematic abuse that made my own situation seem like just one thread in a much larger web. At the Henderson place, now standing empty with a Texas and Pacific Railroad Company sign posted at the gate, we spoke with neighbors who remembered the pressure that had been brought to bear on the elderly couple. Their son, coincidentally, had also been offered a job with the railroad company just before convincing his parents to sell. "They were good people," said Mrs. Chen, whose family had immigrated from China to work on the railroad before establishing a small market garden. "Mr. Henderson, he cried when he signed those papers. Said it felt like selling his own children." At the Kowalski farm, we found the family living in a single room above the general store, their once prosperous spread now part of the railroad's expanding land holdings. Stefan Kowalski, a proud Polish immigrant who had built his farm from nothing, looked broken as he told us about the sudden loan demands and the legal fees that had consumed his savings. "They said I was behind on payments that I knew were current," he explained, his accent thick with emotion. "When I showed them my records, they said their books were the only ones that mattered. The lawyer they recommended to help me, he was working for the railroad company all along." Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a conspiracy that went far beyond simple land acquisition. The railroad company was destroying families, erasing the dreams of immigrants and pioneers who had built their lives on the Texas frontier, all in service of corporate profits and expansion. By the time we returned to my ranch, we had documented evidence of fraud affecting at least 12 families in Cedar Falls County. The pattern was always the same: identify valuable properties owned by elderly or vulnerable families, infiltrate through marriage or employment, create financial pressure through manipulated loans or legal challenges, then acquire the land at far below market value. Jake helped me organize the evidence in Thomas's old study, spreading documents across the large oak desk where my husband had once planned the expansion of our ranch. The irony was not lost on me. We were using the heart of the Double T Ranch to plan the destruction of those who sought to steal it. "Martha," Jake said as we worked by lamplight, "you realize what you're taking on here. The railroad company has lawyers, politicians, judges in their pocket. They've been planning this for years." I looked up from the ledger where I was recording the details of each family's story, feeling the weight of the Cherokee medallion against my chest. "Jake, my grandmother used to tell me stories about the Trail of Tears, about how our people were driven from their ancestral lands by men who used law and government as weapons against the innocent. She said the only way to fight such evil was to refuse to be silent, to speak truth even when it seemed hopeless." Jake nodded slowly, understanding the deeper significance of what I was saying. "And you think we can win against these people?" "I think we have to try," I replied, my voice carrying the conviction that had been building since Standing Bear's counsel. "But we're not going to fight them on their terms. We're going to use their own methods against them. expose their corruption in ways they never anticipated. The next morning, I rode to the county courthouse in the neighboring town of Brazoria, where the land records were kept and legal documents filed. The clerk, a young man named Timothy Walsh, recognized me as the widow of Thomas Hughes and treated me with the respect due to a longtime resident of the county. "Mrs. Hughes," he said, "what brings you to our humble courthouse?" "I need to research property transfers over the past 2 years," I explained, settling into a chair at the research table. "Specifically, sales involving the Texas and Pacific Railroad Company. What I discovered in those dusty record books confirmed our worst fears. The railroad had acquired over 30,000 acres in the county through suspicious transactions, many involving elderly property owners who had sold for fractions of market value. The legal documents were filled with technical language that would have confused most ranchers, and many bore the signatures of the same lawyers who claimed to represent the sellers' interests. But there was something else in those records that made my Cherokee blood run cold. Among the properties already acquired by the railroad was a section of land that had been designated as Cherokee burial grounds, sacred sites that should have been protected under federal treaty. The railroad had purchased this land from a man who had no legal right to sell it, using forged documents and bribed officials to legitimize the theft. As I copied the relevant information into my notebook, I realized that this case was about more than saving individual ranches or exposing corporate corruption. It was about protecting the sacred places of my people, about honoring the treaties and promises that had been made to the Cherokee Nation, about standing up to the same kind of systematic theft that had driven us from our ancestral homes decades earlier. When I returned to the Double T Ranch that evening, I found Standing Bear waiting on my porch, his ancient eyes bright with the fire of righteous anger. "The spirits have been speaking to me, granddaughter," he said without preamble. "They tell me you have discovered something that goes beyond your personal struggle." I showed him the documents I had copied, watching his face grow grave as he read about the desecration of Cherokee sacred sites. When he finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folding the papers with reverence. "Now," he said finally, "we do not fight just for your ranch or your dignity. We fight for the bones of our ancestors and the promises made to our people. This is no longer just your battle, Martha Two Eagles. This is a war for the soul of our community." The Cherokee Council fire burned bright against the October night as representatives from 3 different tribal communities gathered in Standing Bear's Grove. Word had spread quickly through the network of Cherokee families scattered across East Texas about the desecration of sacred burial grounds and the systematic theft of treaty-protected lands. What had begun as my personal battle against Victoria's greed had transformed into something far more significant: a fight for the preservation of Cherokee heritage and the protection of an entire frontier community. Standing Bear opened the council with the ancient words that had guided our people through centuries of struggle, his voice carrying across the circle of faces illuminated by firelight. Elders from as far away as the Neches River had made the journey, bringing with them the collective wisdom of survivors who had endured removal, war, and decades of systematic oppression. Brothers and sisters. Standing Bear began in Cherokee, then switched to English so that Jake Morrison and the other white allies present could understand. "We gather tonight not just to mourn the violation of our sacred places, but to plan how we will protect them and our community from those who see our land as nothing more than profit to be harvested." Gray Wolf, an elder from the Cherokee community near Nacogdoches, spoke first. His weathered hands held copies of the original treaties that had guaranteed Cherokee rights to certain sacred sites in East Texas. These papers were signed by the government of Texas and witnessed by federal officials. They promised that our burial grounds would be protected forever. Yet now we find railroad tracks running through the bones of our ancestors. The violation was even worse than I had initially discovered. The railroad company had not simply purchased Cherokee burial grounds, they had knowingly desecrated them, grinding ancient bones into the roadbed and scattering sacred artifacts like worthless debris. The spiritual wound went deeper than any financial theft, striking at the very heart of Cherokee identity and reverence for the ancestors. "The law is on our side," said Joseph Ridge, a Cherokee lawyer who had traveled from the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory. "Federal treaties supersede state land laws, and the desecration of native burial grounds violates multiple federal statutes. But we'll need more than legal documents to win this fight. We'll need evidence, witnesses, and political pressure." Jake Morrison cleared his throat respectfully before speaking. "Mrs. Hughes and I have been documenting the railroad's fraudulent land acquisitions throughout the county. We have evidence of forged documents, bribed officials, and systematic fraud affecting dozens of families. This isn't just about Cherokee rights, it's about protecting every honest family from corporate thieves." The alliance that emerged from that council fire was unlike anything Cedar Falls County had ever seen. Cherokee elders worked alongside German immigrants. Mexican railroad workers joined forces with Irish farmers, and Chinese merchants offered their support to Polish homesteaders. The railroad company's greed had created an enemy more diverse and determined than they could have imagined. Over the following days, our coalition grew stronger and more organized. Elena Vasquez coordinated the Mexican railroad families, using their insider knowledge of company operations to identify weak points in the corporate structure. Heinrich Müller organized the German immigrant community, whose experience with legal documentation and record-keeping proved invaluable in building our case. Dr. Crawford, one of the few college-educated men in the county, volunteered to help us navigate the complex legal system. "What the railroad company has done here represents a fundamental assault on the rule of law," he told our planning committee. "If they can steal Cherokee burial grounds and defraud elderly ranchers with impunity, then no one's property rights are safe." The most surprising ally came from an unexpected source. Timothy Walsh, the young courthouse clerk who had helped me research property records, approached me privately with information that could change everything. "Mrs. Hughes," he said nervously, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "I've been thinking about those railroad documents you were researching. Some of the signatures on the transfer papers, they don't match the signatures on other legal documents filed by the same people." His observation was crucial. If we could prove that signatures had been forged on property transfer documents, we would have evidence of criminal fraud that even corrupt judges would find difficult to ignore. "Timothy," I said carefully, "would you be willing to testify to that in court?" The young man's face paled, but his jaw set with determination. My grandfather came to Texas with nothing but hope and hard work. He built a life here because he believed in justice and fair dealing. If I don't stand up to these thieves, what kind of man does that make me? As our evidence mounted and our alliance strengthened, I found myself in the unexpected role of coordinator and strategist. The Cherokee medallion around my neck had become a symbol of resistance, not just for my own people, but for every family that had been targeted by the railroad's systematic theft. Standing Bear had been right about the power of waiting and choosing the right moment to strike. But he had also taught me something else, that true strength comes not from fighting alone, but from building connections that transcend the boundaries others try to impose. The diversity of our coalition was our greatest weapon. The railroad company had counted on dividing us Cherokee against white, immigrant against native-born, Mexican against German. Instead, their greed had united us in ways that reflected the best of what the Texas frontier could offer. Our strategy sessions took place in different locations each night, sometimes in Standing Bear's lodge, sometimes in Heinrich Muller's blacksmith shop, sometimes in the back room of the Chen family's market. The constant movement kept our plans secret while demonstrating the broad base of our support. They think they're fighting a confused old Cherokee woman and a handful of displaced farmers, Jake observed during one of our planning meetings. They have no idea they're facing an entire community that's finally decided to stand together. The legal strategy we developed was multifaceted, attacking the railroad's conspiracy from several angles simultaneously. Joseph Ridge would file federal charges related to the desecration of Cherokee burial grounds and treaty violations. Dr. Crawford would document the medical and psychological harm done to elderly victims of the fraud. Timothy Walsh would provide evidence of forged signatures and document tampering. But our most powerful weapon was something the railroad company could never have anticipated: the moral authority that comes from standing up for what's right, regardless of the personal cost. As I sat in my kitchen on the final night before we would begin our legal assault, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A week ago, I had been an isolated ranch widow, humiliated by her son's wife and facing the loss of everything she held dear. Now I was the center of a movement that could reshape how justice was administered on the Texas frontier. The Cherokee medallion caught the lamplight as I reviewed our final preparations. Tomorrow, Victoria and Samuel would discover that the woman they had tried to destroy was backed by the combined strength of an entire community. Tomorrow, the railroad company would learn that their victims had found their voice and their power. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Double T Ranch as I prepared to reveal the final piece of information that would transform our fight from a desperate defense into a strategic offensive. Standing Bear sat across from me at Thomas's old oak desk, his weathered hands holding documents that would shake the very foundations of the railroad company's conspiracy. "Granddaughter," he said quietly, "are you certain you wish to reveal these secrets once spoken? They cannot be taken back." I touched the Cherokee medallion at my throat, feeling the weight of generations of strong women who had faced impossible odds with courage and wisdom. "Uncle, my husband always said that the most dangerous enemy is the one who underestimates you. The railroad company has built their entire scheme on the assumption that I'm a poor Cherokee widow with no resources to fight back. It's time to show them how wrong they are." The documents spread across the desk told a story that even I sometimes found difficult to believe. Thomas had not simply been a successful rancher, he had been one of the most astute investors in Texas, using his understanding of railroad expansion and cattle markets to build a fortune that rivaled those of the Eastern financiers who thought they could manipulate frontier communities with impunity. "Look at this, Uncle," I said, pointing to a stock certificate dated 1878. Thomas bought shares in the Texas and Pacific Railroad Company when they were trading for $3 each. Today, those same shares are worth $47 each, and I own 12,000 of them. Standing Bear's eyes widened as he calculated the implications. "You own part of the very company that seeks to steal your land." "More than a part," I replied, pulling out additional documents. Between the railroad stocks, the cattle futures contracts, and the mineral rights Thomas purchased throughout East Texas, I control assets worth over $200,000. I'm not just fighting to save my ranch, I'm fighting to protect investments that make me one of the wealthiest individuals in the county. The revelation was staggering, even to me. For years, I had lived simply and quietly, allowing people to assume that I was struggling to maintain the ranch on a widow's pension. In reality, the monthly dividends from my investments alone were more than most families earned in a year. But there was another secret, one that connected directly to our fight for Cherokee sacred sites. Among Thomas's papers, I had discovered mineral rights to several sections of land that included the burial grounds the railroad had desecrated. Rights that had been legally transferred to Cherokee tribal ownership before the railroad's fraudulent purchase. "This changes everything," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient authority. Not only do you have the financial resources to fight them in court, but you have legal standing to challenge their ownership of Cherokee sacred lands. That afternoon, I called a meeting of our coalition leaders, gathering them in the Double T Ranch's main parlor for the first time. Jake Morrison arrived first, followed by Joseph Ridge, Dr. Crawford, Heinrich Muller, and Elena Vasquez. The diversity of the group: Cherokee elder, German blacksmith, Irish rancher, Mexican labor organizer, and college-educated doctor represented the true strength of our frontier community. "Friends," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "I've asked you here because it's time you knew the full truth about what we're fighting for and what resources we have to fight with." I opened Thomas's leather portfolio and spread the financial documents across the parlor table. The silence that followed was profound as each person grasped the implications of what they were seeing. Jake Morrison was the first to speak, his weathered face breaking into a slow grin. "Martha, you sly fox. You've been sitting on a fortune while letting everyone think you were struggling to keep the ranch afloat." "It was Thomas's idea," I explained. "He believed that visible wealth attracted problems, that it was safer to live modestly and invest quietly. He was right if Victoria and the railroad company had known about these assets. They would have tried much more aggressive tactics to steal them." "Doctor?" Crawford adjusted his spectacles as he studied the railroad stock certificates. "Mrs. Hughes, do you realize that your holdings make you one of the largest individual shareholders in the Texas and Pacific Railroad Company? You have voting rights, board representation, access to company records." The implications were staggering. As a major shareholder, I had legal rights to examine the company's books, to challenge fraudulent transactions, to demand accountability from the board of directors. The railroad company had been committing crimes against one of their own investors. Joseph Ridge, the Cherokee lawyer, was examining the mineral rights documents with growing excitement. "Martha, these mineral rights predate the railroad's land purchases by 5 years. Under federal law, mineral rights take precedence over surface rights, especially when they involve treaty-protected Cherokee lands." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Elena Vasquez asked. "It means," Joseph replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a lawyer who had found the perfect legal weapon, "that Martha can shut down railroad construction on Cherokee burial grounds immediately. She owns the mineral rights, which include the right to preserve the surface for cultural and religious purposes." Heinrich Muller leaned back in his chair, shaking his head in amazement. "Mein Gott, Martha, you are not just fighting to save your ranch. You are fighting as one of the most powerful people in the county." The transformation in our group's dynamic was immediate and profound. What had been a desperate coalition of victims fighting against overwhelming odds had become a strategic alliance led by someone with the financial and legal resources to take on the railroad company as an equal. But with that power came responsibility. Standing Bear's words from our first council meeting echoed in my mind. Sometimes the greatest victory comes not from meeting force with force, but from using the enemy's own momentum against them. "There's something else," I said, pulling out the final document that would complete our strategic advantage. Thomas didn't just invest in the railroad company, he also invested in their competitors. I own significant shares in 3 other railroad companies that have been trying to gain access to Texas markets. The room fell silent as the full implications sank in. Not only could I challenge the Texas and Pacific Railroad from within as a major shareholder, but I could also bring competitive pressure from their business rivals. Jake Morrison whistled low. "Martha, you don't just have the resources to fight them, you have the power to destroy them." "I don't want to destroy them," I replied, feeling the weight of Cherokee wisdom tempering my desire for justice. "I want to stop their crimes. protect our community, and ensure that they never again think they can steal from honest people with impunity." Standing Bear nodded approvingly. "This is the way of the Cherokee warrior, not to seek unnecessary destruction, but to use strength in service of justice and protection of the people." As the meeting concluded and our allies departed with renewed confidence, I stood on the ranch house porch watching the sun set over the Texas prairie. Tomorrow, Victoria and Samuel would discover that the woman they had tried to humiliate and dispossess was not a helpless victim, but one of the most powerful people in the county. The Cherokee medallion caught the last rays of sunlight as I whispered a prayer of gratitude to Thomas's spirit and to the ancestors who had guided me through this transformation. The battle ahead would still be difficult, but now we would fight it on equal terms, with the combined strength of community solidarity and financial power that could not be ignored or dismissed. The railroad company had made the mistake of underestimating a Cherokee woman. Tomorrow, they would begin to understand the true cost of that error. The morning of reckoning arrived with the crisp clarity of a Texas autumn day. I dressed carefully in the same burgundy silk dress and Cherokee jewelry I had worn to Samuel's wedding, but this time I wore them as armor rather than defiance. The turquoise necklace lay against my throat like a shield blessed by ancient spirits, while the silver medallion Standing Bear had given me rested over my heart, a reminder of the strength that flowed through my veins. Jake Morrison arrived at sunrise with a wagon loaded with document boxes, his weathered face set with grim determination. "Martha," he said as we loaded the evidence of the railroad's crimes, "are you ready for this? Once we walk into that courthouse, there's no turning back." "There was no turning back the moment Victoria slapped me," I replied, my voice carrying the steel that had been forged through weeks of investigation and community building. Today, she and everyone else will learn exactly who they chose to make an enemy. The ride into Cedar Falls drew attention from the very beginning. Word had spread through the frontier community's efficient gossip network that something significant was about to happen. As our wagon rolled down Main Street, I saw faces in windows, groups gathering on porches, and the unmistakable buzz of a town that sensed drama in the air. At the courthouse, Joseph Ridge was waiting with a leather satchel full of legal documents and the quiet confidence of a Cherokee lawyer who had spent years fighting for his people's rights in hostile courts. Dr. Crawford stood beside him, his medical bag in hand and his scholarly demeanor lending gravitas to our cause. "Mrs. Hughes," Joseph said formally, "are you prepared to proceed with the filing of charges against the Texas and Pacific Railroad Company for fraud, conspiracy, and violation of federal treaty rights?" "I am," I replied, feeling the weight of Cherokee generations settling on my shoulders like a ceremonial blanket. "Let's begin." The courthouse steps filled quickly as news of our arrival spread through town. Elena Vasquez led a group of Mexican railroad families, their faces serious but hopeful. Heinrich Müller brought the German immigrant community, their solidarity evident in their unified presence. The Chen family represented the Chinese merchants, while Timothy Walsh stood with other young courthouse workers who had chosen justice over job security. But it was Standing Bear's arrival that truly announced the gravity of what was about to unfold. The Cherokee elder approached on his pinto horse, followed by a delegation of tribal representatives from across East Texas. Their presence transformed what might have been seen as a simple legal dispute into a matter of federal treaty rights and cultural preservation. The courthouse doors opened, and Colonel Hayes emerged with Victoria and Samuel beside him. The railroad manager's confident stride faltered when he saw the size and diversity of the crowd that had gathered. Victoria's face went pale as she recognized faces from the wedding celebration people who had witnessed her racist tirade and public assault. Samuel looked like a man caught between two worlds. his eyes darting between his mother and his wife with the expression of someone who was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had helped set in motion. "Mrs. Hughes," Colonel Hayes called out, his voice carrying across the courthouse square with forced authority. "I understand you have some concerns about railroad business practices. Perhaps we could discuss this privately, without involving the entire town in what should be a simple family matter." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable, and I heard several people in the crowd mutter angrily, but I had learned from Standing Bear's wisdom about choosing the right moment to reveal one's true strength. "Colonel Hayes," I replied, my voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "This stopped being a simple family matter when your company began systematically defrauding elderly property owners and desecrating Cherokee's sacred sites. This became a federal matter when you violated treaty rights. And this became a corporate matter when you began committing crimes against your own shareholders." The last statement hit like a thunderbolt. Colonel Hayes's face went white, while Victoria looked confused and increasingly panicked. Samuel's mouth fell open as he began to grasp implications he had never considered. Joseph Ridge stepped forward with a thick legal document. "Colonel Hayes, as legal representative for Mrs. Martha Two Eagles Hughes, I am serving you with formal notice that my client, as a major shareholder in the Texas and Pacific Railroad Company, is demanding an immediate audit of all land acquisition activities in Cedar Falls County. Furthermore," Dr. Crawford added, consulting his own papers, "we are filing criminal charges for fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and violation of federal statutes protecting Native American burial grounds." The crowd stirred with excitement and satisfaction. This was frontier justice in action, not the rough vigilante justice of popular imagination, but the real thing, community members standing together to protect their rights through legal means and collective action. Colonel Hayes's military bearing cracked visibly. "Mrs. Hughes, I think there's been some misunderstanding about your status in this community. Perhaps if we could speak privately." "My status," I interrupted, feeling Cherokee fire rising in my voice. "Colonel, let me clarify my status for everyone present." I nodded to Jake Morrison, who opened the first document box and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I am Martha Two Eagles Hughes, owner of the Double T Ranch and widow of Thomas Hughes. I am also, as of this morning's count, the holder of 12,000 shares of Texas and Pacific Railroad Company stock, making me the third largest individual shareholder in your company." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Victoria staggered backward as if physically struck, while Samuel's face went through a series of expressions from shock to horror to dawning comprehension. "I am also," I continued relentlessly, "the legal owner of mineral rights to approximately 15,000 acres in East Texas, including the Cherokee burial grounds your company has been desecrating. Rights that predate your fraudulent land purchases and give me the legal authority to halt all railroad construction on Cherokee sacred sites." Colonel Hayes looked like a man who had just realized he had been playing poker with someone who had been hiding a royal flush. The confidence that had carried him through months of systematic fraud evaporated like morning mist. Standing Bear stepped forward, his presence commanding respect from even the most prejudiced members of the crowd. "The Cherokee Nation recognizes Martha Two Eagles Hughes as our representative in this matter. Her fight is our fight. Her victory will be our victory." The transformation was complete. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate and dispossess a supposedly helpless Cherokee widow had become a confrontation between a major railroad corporation and a coalition of community members led by one of the most powerful individuals in the county. Victoria found her voice at last, but it came out as a desperate shriek. "This is impossible. She's just an old Indian woman living on a rundown ranch. She can't have that kind of money. The racist language that had seemed so powerful when used to intimidate now revealed itself as the ignorant prejudice it had always been. Several people in the crowd hissed their disapproval, while others shook their heads in disgust. "Victoria," I said quietly, my words carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "You made the mistake of judging people by their appearance rather than their character. Today, you begin to learn the cost of that error." The courthouse square had become an amphitheater of frontier justice, with the entire community of Cedar Falls bearing witness to a confrontation that would be remembered for generations. Victoria's desperate shriek still echoed in the morning air. But the racist words that had once carried power now revealed themselves as the ignorant prejudice of a woman who had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the community she had tried to manipulate. Timothy Walsh emerged from the courthouse carrying a thick ledger book, his young face set with the determination of someone who had chosen justice over job security. "Mrs. Hughes," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "I have the property records you requested, including all the forged signatures and fraudulent transfers." Colonel Hayes made a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Now see here, Mrs. Hughes, even if you do own some railroad stock, that doesn't give you the right to interfere with legitimate business operations. The Texas and Pacific Railroad Company is engaged in vital work expanding commerce and civilization throughout civilization." Standing Bear's voice cut through the colonel's bluster like a blade through silk. The Cherokee elder stepped forward with the dignity that commanded respect from all who knew him, his weathered hands holding a bundle of documents that would shatter the railroad's claims to legitimacy. "You speak of civilization while grinding the bones of Cherokee ancestors into your roadbed? You speak of legitimate business while forging signatures and stealing land from elderly families." The crowd stirred with angry murmurs. Many of the people present had lost friends and neighbors to the railroad's systematic fraud, and Standing Bear's words gave voice to their long-suppressed fury. Joseph Ridge opened his legal portfolio and withdrew a document that bore official seals and ribbons. "Colonel Hayes, this is a federal injunction issued by the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Texas, ordering the immediate cessation of all railroad construction on Cherokee burial grounds and treaty-protected lands. Violation of this injunction carries penalties of up to 10 years in federal prison." The legal document passed through the crowd, examined by those who could read and explained to those who could not. The reality was sinking in. This was not simply a dispute between a railroad company and a local widow. This was a federal case involving treaty rights, corporate fraud, and the systematic violation of laws designed to protect both Native Americans and elderly property owners. "Dr. Crawford stepped forward with his own contribution to the mounting evidence. "I have here medical documentation of the psychological and physical harm done to 12 elderly residents of this county through the railroad company's fraudulent practices. Mr. Henderson died of heart failure 3 weeks after being forced to sell his ranch. Mrs. Kowalski has been unable to eat or sleep properly since losing her family's farm. This is not simply theft, it is systematic abuse of our most vulnerable citizens." Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. "Stop this!" she screamed, her carefully cultivated Eastern refinement dissolving into raw panic. "You can't do this to us. We're respectable people. We have plans. We have debts to pay." The admission slipped out before she could stop herself, and the crowd seized on it immediately. Elena Vasquez called out in accented but clear English. "So you marry for money to pay your debts? You steal from old women to solve your problems?" Heinrich Muller's voice boomed across the square with German-accented indignation. "In my country, we have a word for people who marry for money and steal from the elderly. We call them criminals." Samuel finally found his voice, but it came out as a broken whisper. "Mother, I didn't know. I didn't understand what they were planning. I thought I thought you really were struggling, that you needed help managing the ranch. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised with Cherokee values of honesty and respect for elders. The young man who had allowed himself to be corrupted by promises of easy wealth and social advancement. The pain in my heart was sharper than any physical wound, but Standing Bear's wisdom echoed in my mind. Sometimes the greatest teaching comes through allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. Samuel, I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed square. You didn't know because you chose not to know. You didn't understand because understanding would have required you to question what you wanted to believe. You thought I was struggling because that made it easier to justify taking what wasn't yours. Jake Morrison stepped forward with another document box, this one containing the financial records that would complete Victoria's humiliation. Folks, he announced to the crowd, I think you should know exactly how wealthy the woman they tried to cheat really is. He opened the box and began reading from Thomas's investment records. As of yesterday's market closing, Martha Hughes owns railroad stock worth $564,000. She owns mineral rights valued at over $300,000. She owns cattle futures contracts worth $150,000. Her total net worth exceeds $1 million, making her one of the wealthiest individuals in all of East Texas. The numbers hit the crowd like thunder. In 1883, $1 million was a fortune beyond most people's comprehension, the kind of wealth associated with Eastern industrialists and European nobility. The idea that such wealth had been living quietly among them, disguised as a simple ranch widow, was almost impossible to process. Victoria staggered backward, her face white with shock and growing understanding of the magnitude of her miscalculation. That's impossible, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation irrefutable. Furthermore, Joseph Ridge added with the satisfaction of a lawyer delivering a killing blow. As a major shareholder in the Texas and Pacific Railroad Company, Mrs. Hughes has the legal right to examine all company books, to challenge fraudulent transactions, and to demand the immediate termination of any employees involved in criminal activities. Colonel Hayes's military bearing finally collapsed entirely. The man who had orchestrated a systematic campaign of fraud and intimidation now looked like what he truly was, a common criminal who had been caught by someone far more intelligent and better prepared than he had ever imagined possible. Standing Bear raised his hand for silence, and the crowd immediately quieted out of respect for his age and wisdom. My friends, he said in the voice that had guided Cherokee communities through decades of struggle. Today we have seen the power that comes when a community stands together against those who would prey upon the innocent. Today we have seen that justice is possible when people of different backgrounds unite for what is right. He turned to face Victoria and Samuel directly. You chose to see Martha Two Eagles Hughes as a victim because of her age, her heritage, and her quiet way of living. You mistook wisdom for weakness, humility for poverty, and dignity for vulnerability. Today, you learn that the Cherokee way of living in harmony with the earth and honoring one's ancestors is not a sign of primitiveness, but of strength that runs deeper than your shallow understanding could ever comprehend. The Cherokee elders' words carried the weight of centuries of survival, of a people who had endured removal, war, and systematic oppression yet still maintained their identity and values. In that moment, the entire crowd understood that this confrontation was about more than money or land. It was about the fundamental question of what kind of community Cedar Falls would become. Victoria's last desperate gambit came out as a wail of disbelief. But she's just an Indian. She can't be richer than us. It's not supposed to work that way. The racist outburst sealed her fate in the court of public opinion. Even those community members who might have harbored their own prejudices were appalled by the naked hatred in her voice and the implication that Native Americans had no right to prosperity or respect. I stepped forward, feeling the strength of my ancestors flowing through me like a river of liquid fire. "Victoria," I said with quiet authority, "you are about to learn that being Cherokee doesn't make me less than you. It makes me stronger than you ever imagined possible." The moment had come for the final revelation, the one that would complete Victoria's understanding of just how catastrophically she had miscalculated. I reached into the leather portfolio Jake Morrison held and withdrew the document that even Standing Bear had not seen until this morning, the geological survey that would transform this confrontation from a victory into a complete rout. "Victoria," I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority that comes from absolute certainty. "You wanted to know how a Cherokee woman could possess such wealth. You assumed that because I honored my ancestors and lived simply, I must be poor and powerless. Allow me to complete your education." I held up the survey document, its official seals catching the morning sunlight. "This is a geological assessment commissioned by my late husband in 1879, documenting mineral deposits on Cherokee treaty lands throughout East Texas. Lands that include not only the burial grounds your railroad desecrated, but also some of the richest gold and silver deposits ever discovered in Texas." The crowd stirred with excitement and amazement. Gold discoveries were the stuff of legends in Texas, stories that could transform entire communities overnight. But this was not a wild claim or prospector's dream. This was documented fact, supported by official surveys and legal mineral rights. Joseph Ridge stepped forward with another set of documents. "The Cherokee Nation holds exclusive mineral rights to these deposits under the Treaty of 1835, rights that were never ceded to the state of Texas and remain valid under federal law. Mrs. Hughes, as the designated Cherokee representative for these lands, controls mining rights to deposits valued at over $3 million. The number struck the crowd like lightning. $3 million in gold and silver, controlled by the woman they had watched being slapped and humiliated just days earlier. Victoria's legs gave way, and she sank to her knees on the courthouse steps, her face white with shock and dawning comprehension of the magnitude of her mistake. Colonel Hayes made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Even if these claims are valid, the railroad has already invested significant resources in this region. Surely some accommodation can be reached." "Colonel," I interrupted, my voice cutting through his plea like a Cherokee war cry. "The only accommodation that will be reached is the one dictated by federal law and basic human decency. Your company will immediately cease all operations on Cherokee lands. You will restore the burial grounds you desecrated. You will return all property fraudulently obtained from elderly residents of this county. And you will compensate every family you have harmed." Standing Bear moved to stand beside me, his weathered hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture that conveyed both support and the full authority of the Cherokee Nation. "The spirits of our ancestors cry out for justice," he said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "Today, that justice is delivered not through violence or revenge, but through the strength of a Cherokee woman who never forgot who she was or where she came from." "Doctor." Crawford opened his medical bag and withdrew a small vial of earth. "This soil was taken from the Cherokee burial ground that the railroad destroyed. It contains the bones and artifacts of people who lived on this land for centuries before any of us arrived. Mrs. Hughes is fighting not just for her own rights, but for the right of the dead to rest in peace and the right of the living to honor their ancestors." The symbolism was powerful and unmistakable. This was not simply about money or property, it was about fundamental questions of respect, dignity, and the right of all people to preserve their cultural heritage. Samuel finally found the courage to speak, his voice broken with shame and realization. "Mother," he said, stepping away from Victoria and moving toward me with hesitant steps. I don't know how to apologize for what I've done. I don't know how to make this right. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised with Cherokee values, who had allowed himself to be corrupted by greed and prejudice. The pain in my heart was still sharp. But Standing Bear's wisdom about forgiveness and redemption echoed in my mind. "Samuel," I said quietly, "making this right begins with understanding what you did wrong. You chose to see your own mother as an obstacle to your happiness, rather than as a person deserving of love and respect. You allowed someone else's prejudice to poison your heart against your own heritage. You participated in a conspiracy to steal from the very woman who gave you life." His tears came then, the deep, wrenching sobs of a man who finally understood the full magnitude of his betrayal. "I'm so sorry, Mother. I'm so ashamed. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Forgiveness is not about what you deserve, son," I replied, feeling the Cherokee teachings about redemption and healing flowing through me. "Forgiveness is about what kind of person I choose to be. But forgiveness does not mean there are no consequences. You will have to live with what you've done, and you will have to earn back the trust you threw away." Victoria struggled to her feet, her wedding dress now stained with dust and tears. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My family has connections, resources. We'll fight this in court." Jake Morrison laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. "Victoria, your family's resources don't amount to pocket change compared to what Martha controls. And as for connections, you just made an enemy of one of the most powerful women in Texas in front of the entire community. Good luck finding anyone willing to help you now." Timothy Walsh approached with a final document, his young face bright with the satisfaction of someone who had chosen justice over personal safety. "Mrs. Hughes," he said formally, "I have here the complete record of every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, and every illegal transfer the railroad company has conducted in this county. This evidence will ensure that criminal charges can be filed against everyone involved in the conspiracy." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Justice was being served not through vigilante violence, but through the proper application of law and the collective action of a community that had decided to stand together against corruption. Standing Bear raised his hand for silence, and when the crowd quieted, he spoke with the authority of a man who had witnessed decades of struggle and survival. "Today, the Cherokee people have achieved a great victory, not just for ourselves, but for all who believe in justice and the rule of law." Martha Two Eagles Hughes has shown that strength comes not from the color of one's skin or the amount of money in one's bank account, but from the courage to stand up for what is right. I felt the weight of the Cherokee medallion against my chest and the warmth of my grandmother's turquoise necklace at my throat. The spirits of my ancestors seemed to whisper their approval on the Texas wind, reminding me that this victory belonged not just to me, but to all the Cherokee women who had fought and sacrificed to preserve our heritage for future generations. Colonel Hayes, his military bearing completely collapsed, made one final attempt at dignity. "Mrs. Hughes," he said quietly, "what are your terms?" I looked at the man who had orchestrated a campaign of systematic fraud and cultural destruction, then at the community that had rallied to support justice and truth. "My terms are simple, Colonel. Justice, restitution, and respect. Nothing more, nothing less." The battle was over. Justice had been delivered, and Cedar Falls, Texas, would never be the same. The aftermath of justice delivered was swift and decisive. Within hours of our courthouse confrontation, Colonel Hayes found himself under arrest by federal marshals who had been summoned by Joseph Ridge's telegrams to Austin and Washington. The charges were extensive fraud, conspiracy, violation of federal treaty rights, and desecration of Native American burial grounds. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, The man who had orchestrated a campaign of systematic theft looked like what he truly was, a common criminal who had finally been caught. Victoria's collapse was even more dramatic. With her family's debts now exposed and their connection to the railroad conspiracy revealed, the Eastern social connections she had counted on evaporated like morning mist. Her parents, faced with criminal charges of their own, abandoned Cedar Falls on the afternoon train, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. I found her sitting on the steps of the boarding house where she and Samuel had been staying, her expensive wedding dress now wrinkled and stained, her carefully arranged hair disheveled. For the first time since I had known her, Victoria Ashford looked like what she had always been beneath the veneer of Eastern refinement, a frightened young woman who had gambled everything on a scheme that had backfired catastrophically. "Mrs. Hughes," she said without looking up as I approached. "I suppose you've come to gloat over your victory." I settled beside her on the wooden steps, feeling the weight of Cherokee wisdom tempering any desire for revenge. "Victoria, I've come to offer you something you never offered me, a chance at redemption." She looked up then, her blue eyes red with tears and confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean that despite everything you've done, you're still my son's wife. You're still family, whether I like it or not. And Cherokee families don't abandon their members, even when they've made terrible mistakes." The words seemed to hit her harder than any accusation or threat could have. "But I said such terrible things about you, about your heritage. I tried to steal your home, your land. I slapped you in front of the entire town." "Yes, you did," I agreed quietly. "And now you have to live with the consequences of those actions. But consequences don't have to mean the end of everything. They can also be the beginning of wisdom." Samuel appeared around the corner of the boarding house, his face haggard with shame and sleepless worry. He had spent the night walking the streets of Cedar Falls, trying to understand how his life had changed so completely in the space of a few hours. "Mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to face you after what I've done. I don't know how to face anyone in this town." I stood and walked to my son, seeing in his face the boy I had raised with Cherokee values of honesty and respect for elders. That boy was still there, buried beneath the corruption and greed, waiting to be reclaimed. "Samuel," I said, placing my hands on his shoulders, "facing what you've done is the first step toward becoming the man I raised you to be. Running away from it, making excuses, blaming others, that's the path that led you here. Accepting responsibility and working to make amends, that's the path that leads home." His tears came then, the deep, cleansing sobs of a man who had finally stopped lying to himself. "I'm so sorry, Mother. I'm so ashamed of what I became. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve, son," I replied, echoing the Cherokee teachings my grandmother had shared with me. "Forgiveness is about what kind of person I choose to be. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You lost your job with the railroad when Colonel Hayes was arrested. You have debts that need to be paid. You have trust that needs to be rebuilt, not just with me, but with this entire community." Jake Morrison approached from across the street, his weathered face showing the concern of a man who had watched Samuel grow up and still hoped for his redemption. "Martha," he said quietly, "the boy's going to need work if he's going to make things right. I could use help with the fall roundup, if you think he's ready to earn an honest living." The offer was more generous than Samuel deserved, and we all knew it. But that was the nature of frontier communities they believed in, second chances for those willing to work for them. "That's up to Samuel," I replied, looking at my son with a mixture of hope and caution. "The question is whether he's ready to do the kind of hard, Honest work that builds character instead of looking for easy money that corrupts it. Samuel straightened his shoulders, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimpse of the man I had hoped he would become. Mr. Morrison, I'd be honored to work for you. I'll do whatever you need, for whatever wages you think I'm worth. Standing Bear emerged from the crowd that had been watching our family drama unfold. The Cherokee elder's presence commanded respect from everyone present, and his words would carry the weight of tribal authority. Samuel Hughes, he said formally, you have brought shame not only on your mother and yourself, but on the Cherokee blood that flows in your veins. You allowed others to convince you that your heritage was something to be hidden rather than honored. You participated in the desecration of your ancestors' burial grounds. Samuel's face went white, and he sank to his knees before the elder in a gesture of respect and supplication that showed he finally understood the spiritual dimensions of his betrayal. However, Standing Bear continued, the Cherokee way is not to cast out those who have lost their path, but to help them find their way back to the teachings of their ancestors. If you are willing to learn, if you are willing to serve, if you are willing to spend years rebuilding what you destroyed in months, then there is hope for your redemption. The old man reached into his medicine bag and withdrew a small piece of turquoise, the same stone that decorated my grandmother's necklace. This stone represents the connection between earth and sky, between the Cherokee people and the Great Spirit. Carry it with you as a reminder of who you are meant to be, not who you allowed yourself to become. Samuel accepted the stone with trembling hands, pressing it to his forehead in a gesture of reverence I had not seen from him since childhood. Thank you, Uncle. I promise I will try to be worthy of this gift. Victoria watched this exchange with growing understanding of just how much she had misunderstood about Cherokee culture and values. Mrs. Hughes, she said quietly, what about me? What happens to me now? I looked at my daughter-in-law, seeing past the prejudice and greed to the frightened young woman beneath. That depends on what you choose to do next. Victoria, you can continue to see Cherokee heritage as something primitive and shameful. Or you can learn to see it as a source of strength and wisdom. You can continue to measure people by their bank accounts and social connections. Or you can learn to value character and integrity. Dr. Crawford approached with Elena Vasquez and several other community members. Mrs. Hughes, he said formally. The town council has asked me to extend an invitation. We'd like you to consider serving as Cedar Falls representative to the state legislature. Your victory today has shown us what's possible when someone with wisdom and resources stands up for what's right. The offer was unexpected and humbling. The idea that this diverse frontier community wanted a Cherokee woman to represent them in the halls of power was a testament to how much had changed in just a few days. I'm honored by your confidence, I replied. But my first responsibility is to my family and my people. However, I will consider how I can best serve this community that has shown such courage in standing up to corruption. As the sun began to set over Cedar Falls, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, I realized that this day had changed more than just my personal circumstances. It had changed the very nature of what was possible in a frontier community where people of different backgrounds could come together in pursuit of justice. The battle was won, but the work of healing and rebuilding was just beginning. 1 week after the courthouse confrontation that had shaken Cedar Falls to its core, I found myself walking the familiar path to Standing Bear's lodge, my heart heavy with the complexity of healing that lay ahead. The victory had been complete, but victories, I was learning, were often easier to achieve than the peace that should follow them. Samuel met me at the edge of the cottonwood grove, his face showing the strain of a man trying to rebuild his life from the ruins of his own making. The turquoise stone Standing Bear had given him hung around his neck on a leather cord, but his hands still trembled when he spoke of the future. "Mother," he said quietly, "Mr. Morrison says I can start work on his ranch tomorrow. I know it's not much, but I have to begin somewhere." The humility in his voice was real, but fragile. A week was not enough time to erase months of corruption and betrayal, but it was enough time to plant the seeds of redemption if they were tended carefully. "Samuel," I replied, placing my hand on his shoulder. "Every journey back to honor begins with a single step. The question is whether you have the strength to keep walking when the path becomes difficult." Victoria emerged from the lodge where she had been sitting with Elena Vasquez, learning basic skills she had never needed in her pampered Eastern life. Her expensive dress was wrinkled and stained, her carefully arranged hair now tied back with a simple ribbon. The transformation was beginning, but it was painful to watch. "Mrs. Hughes," she said, her voice carrying none of its former arrogance. "Elena has been teaching me to make tortillas. I burned the first dozen, but she says I'm getting better." Elena smiled encouragingly. "Senora Victoria is learning that good food, like good character, requires patience and practice. Both take time to develop properly." Standing Bear approached through the trees, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of a teacher whose most difficult students were finally ready to learn. "The healing ceremony will begin soon," he announced. "But first, there are words that must be spoken, truths that must be acknowledged." He gestured for us to sit in a circle around the small fire that burned at the center of the grove. The flames danced in the evening air, casting shadows that seemed to hold the spirits of ancestors who had faced their own struggles with courage and wisdom. "Samuel Hughes," Standing Bear said formally, "you have taken the first step on the path back to your Cherokee heritage, but one step does not make a journey. Are you prepared to walk this path even when it leads through shame, through hard work, through the judgment of those you have wronged?" Samuel's voice was barely above a whisper. "I am, Uncle." "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm willing to work for the chance to earn back what I've lost. And you, Victoria Ashford Hughes," Standing Bear continued, "you have seen the consequences of judging people by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. Are you prepared to learn new ways of seeing, new ways of being?" Victoria's tears came then, the deep sobs of someone finally confronting the ugliness of their own prejudice. "I don't know if I can change," she whispered. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to become someone better." "Strength," Standing Bear replied gently, "is not something you are born with. It is something you develop through facing your fears and choosing to do what is right even when it is difficult." Dr. Crawford arrived with Jake Morrison and several other community members who had been affected by the railroad's conspiracy. Their presence was both judgment and opportunity, the chance for Samuel and Victoria to begin making amends to those they had helped to harm. "The Kowalski family has agreed to meet with you next week," Dr. Crawford told Samuel. "They want to hear your apology in person before they decide whether to support your efforts to find honest work." Jake Morrison's weathered face was stern but not unkind. "Boy, I'm willing to give you a chance because your mother asked me to. But you," as the evening progressed, "other," when the fire burned low and the gathering began to disperse. The Cherokee medallion around my neck caught the moonlight as I whispered a prayer for strength not just for myself, but for all of 6 months after the confrontation that transformed Cedar Falls forever. I sat on the Double T Ranch porch watching the sunrise paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. The Cherokee medallion around my neck caught the first light as I whispered my grandmother's morning prayer, Ski, galvquodiu ala, skiu husti. Thank you for life and for this day. Samuel emerged from the barn, his face showing the deep satisfaction of honest work and restored purpose. The weak young man, corrupted by promises of easy wealth, had become a respected community member, known for his integrity and growing knowledge of Cherokee traditions. Good morning, Mother, he said, settling beside me. Standing Bear says the Cultural Center dedication ceremony is ready. The Cherokee Nation representatives from Oklahoma arrived yesterday. The Cherokee Cultural Center of East Texas had become my proudest achievement, a living testament to using wealth in service of preserving heritage and building understanding between cultures. Victoria appeared carrying coffee and fresh biscuits, her movements showing quiet confidence learned through honest work. The prejudiced Eastern socialite had transformed into a respected teacher, helping immigrant families understand their new home's diverse cultural heritage. Jake Morrison rode up, his weathered face satisfied. Martha, the county commissioners unanimously approved your Cherokee Heritage Trail proposal. It'll bring visitors from across Texas to learn indigenous history. Standing Bear approached on foot, his dignified pace reflecting 70-plus years of wisdom. Granddaughter, he said, settling into his designated rocking chair. The spirits tell me your work here is just beginning? The bridges you've built will carry many generations across divisions that once seemed impossible to cross. As morning progressed, community members gathered for our weekly tradition, neighbors sharing news, solving problems, strengthening bonds that held our diverse community together. The Double T Ranch had become Cedar Falls' unofficial civic center, where Cherokee wisdom and frontier pragmatism combined to address challenges facing our growing town. Timothy Walsh arrived with official news, Mrs. Hughes. The federal courthouse confirmed it. The railroad company's final appeal was denied. All restitution is complete, and Cherokee burial grounds are permanently protected under federal law. As the gathering dispersed, I found myself alone with Standing Bear on the porch that had witnessed so much transformation. Uncle, I said quietly, sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed since Victoria slapped me and demanded my ranch keys. Standing Bear smiled, his weathered face creasing with wisdom-earned lines. Granddaughter, that slap wasn't the end of your old life, it was the beginning of your true purpose. You were meant to be a bridge between worlds, a teacher of what's possible when people choose understanding over ignorance, cooperation over conflict. I touched the Cherokee medallion, feeling ancestral warmth. The Double T Ranch spread before me, no longer just property to protect, but a symbol of what could be achieved when heritage was honored, justice pursued, and communities chose to stand together. The morning breeze carried sage and mesquite scents, cattle sounds, and the distant train whistle that now brought visitors to our cultural center. The railroad that once threatened our community had become a tool for sharing our story with the wider world. As I prepared for another day of my life's mission, preserving Cherokee heritage while building cultural bridges, I offered gratitude to the spirits who had guided me through darkness to this place of purpose and peace. The slap that began this journey was now just memory, but the strength it awakened would serve my community for generations. I was Martha Two Eagles Hughes, Cherokee woman, ranch owner, community leader, and bridge builder between worlds. And this was only the beginning of the story I was meant to tell. As I sit here on my ranch porch, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in Cherokee colors, I reflect on the lessons learned from one of the most painful betrayal stories a mother can endure. When my own son chose greed over family, when his wife's racism nearly destroyed everything I'd built, I discovered that betrayal stories don't always end in bitterness, sometimes they end in wisdom. The Cherokee elders always taught us that betrayal stories serve a purpose beyond the pain they cause. They reveal character, both in those who betray and those who are betrayed. They show us who we truly are when everything we believed about family and loyalty is stripped away. My story taught me that strength doesn't come from avoiding betrayal, but from how we choose to respond when it comes. To anyone facing their own betrayal stories, remember this: your heritage, your dignity, and your worth cannot be stolen by those who fail to see your value. Sometimes the people closest to us lose their way, blinded by greed or prejudice, but that doesn't diminish who you are or what you're capable of achieving. Stand proud in your truth, fight for what's right, and never let anyone convince you that your background makes you less worthy of respect and justice.